Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Sandor Goldstein, and I'm the son of Holocaust survivors. I was born in Hungary in 1946. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. My father was in the forced labor service with the Hungarian army, and this was the case with many Jewish men in Hungary. My mother was deported to Auschwitz and then transferred to Buchenwald. I decided to tell my mother's story as I didn't know very much about my father's story. I actually didn't know too much about my mother's story either, as she rarely talked about her experience in the Holocaust. So when I was first asked about being a second generation speaker, I didn't know if I would be able to do it, as I didn't have very much specific information about my mother's story. But then some things happened that changed this situation. First, a relative sent me copies of documents from the Arolsen archives dealing with my mother's deportation to Auschwitz. The Arolsen archives is a center for documentation of Nazi persecution based in Germany. They've recently made available for public use a huge database on Nazi victims. Then I later came across a book called The Jews of Ujfeherto. This is the town in Hungary where my parents lived. And a good part of the book deals with the experience of Jewish people in the town during the Holocaust. So using these sources, as well as my own knowledge, I feel that I've now been able to put together a fairly detailed and accurate account of my mother's story. But before getting into the details of her story, I just want to tell you a little bit about the a town in Hungary, Ujfeherto, where my parents lived. Both my parents were born and lived in the town of Ujfeherto, Hungary. This is a small city of about 15,000 people in the northeast part of Hungary, not far from the Romanian border. I have it marked here on this map, the dot in the middle, that's Ujfeherto. I've also marked two other places, two larger cities, both about 20 miles from Ujfeherto. This is called Nyregyhaza, and this is called Debrecen. I marked these because I'll be referring to them in my presentation. So there were about 1,500 Jewish people in the town, about 10% of the total population. It was a very close-knit, self-contained Jewish community. There were two synagogues, a Jewish school, a mikvah, which is a ritual bath, a kosher slaughterhouse, and a kosher butcher. Most of the Jews in the town were Orthodox, but there was also a fairly large Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox community. I learned when I went back to Hungary with my daughter a few years ago for a visit and went to visit the Jewish cemetery there, that the Orthodox and Hasidic were two distinct communities. We went, took a taxi over to the cemetery, and as is the case in many cemeteries in Eastern Europe, there was a fence around it with a gate, and on the gate there was a sign that said to call a number and someone will come open the gate for you. So we did that, and in about 10 minutes, an elderly gentleman shows up on a bicycle. He lets us in, takes us to a little building, and there's a number of different books there, and we told him we want to see my grandmother's grave, told him her name. So the first thing he says is, well, what religion was she? And I said, well, she was Jewish. And he said, I know she was Jewish, but to what particular branch? And so I told him she was Orthodox, and that satisfied him, and he was able to find her gravesite. So it shows these were two distinct communities, even as far as where the grave sites were located. So my mother's family had 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. Her mother died of a heart condition in 1943, a year before they were deported. So the older sister took over the household duties, especially cooking. She was a great cook. I remember having many tasty meals at her house. So at the time they were deported, the 4 brothers weren't in the family home, as they would have been conscripted into the forced labor service in the Hungarian army. So only the father and the 3 sisters were in the house at the time they were deported. The three sisters were very close and supported each other throughout the Holocaust and through everything that happened after that. I feel strongly that this closeness among the sisters is what contributed to all three of them surviving the Holocaust. I'll just tell you their names since I'll be referring to them. My mother's name, you've already seen, was Klara. Her older sister's name was Margit, and the younger sister's name was Eva. These were all typically Hungarian names. Many of the merchants in the town were Jewish, and my mother's parents ran a tavern in the town. So before getting into the actual story, I just want to give you a little historical perspective on the Holocaust in Hungary, because it was significantly different than that in other countries in Europe. So although Hungary was fascist and was allied with Germany, for a time it remained an independent country. The usual anti-Jewish measures were implemented there as they were in other countries. Jewish people lost their jobs, their property was confiscated. But for a period of time, Jews were spared the ultimate measure, that of deportation. So we're getting now to the start of 1944, and there were almost 800,000 Jews still left in Hungary, which is right in the middle of Europe. And this became a real sore point for Hitler, since most other Jewish communities have by now been totally destroyed. The country's leader, Miklos Horthy, refused Hitler's repeated demands to deport the Jews. Not only that, but when he tried to enter into a truce with the Allies and get out of the war, well, this was the last straw for Hitler, and Nazi troops invaded Hungary on March 19, 1944. Soon after that, a plan to deport Jews from the country was developed. Jews in the rural communities and smaller towns were to be rounded up and temporarily transferred to synagogues and community buildings. They were then to be transferred to ghettos in larger cities in their vicinity. So in May of 1944, the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz began. In just 8 weeks, some 434,000 Jews were deported in 147 transports. So let's now get back to the situation in Ujfeherto. It was April 1944. Jews were celebrating the last day of Passover. They were walking peacefully home from the synagogue and relaxing. No one suspected anything. The next morning, on April 14th, 1944, at dawn, the gendarmes came from the city of Nyregyhaza, which was about 10 miles away, and started rounding up all the Jews. I should say a few words about gendarmes, since they were somewhat distinct to Hungary. The gendarmes were a special police force in Hungary whose job was to maintain law and order in the countryside. They numbered between 3,000 and 5,000 in 10 districts, somewhat similar to our state police. So the gendarmes woke up all the Jewish families at dawn. They were given 5 to 10 minutes to gather up their most essential clothes and food items. They started announcing on loudspeakers that Jews were not allowed to leave their homes. They couldn't go out to buy bread. This was a particularly burdensome restriction, since during Passover, Jews do not eat bread, so no one had bread at home. The gendarmes directed the roundups. They took Jews to the synagogues and the town hall. Here they took away any jewelry they had with them. They gathered up Jews for 2 days and packed them into crowded buildings like the synagogue. So people generally spend one night by the synagogue or town hall. In the morning, 50 carts with horses were gathered in a row under the direction of the Hungarian gendarmes to take people to the ghetto in the city of Nyregyhaza, which was the closest larger city, about 10 miles away. The driver of each cart was given a list of names of people to go on that cart. 10 people went on one cart. They continued to do this for 2 days. In an interview, one of the drivers of the cart said, "On the long carriage ride, although they seemed okay at the start, after a while, Many of the people were crying. So the drivers of the carts took the people to a special isolated area in the city where only Jews would stay. This was the ghetto. They set up temporary housing for Jews there, something called a transit ghetto. This was done all over the country. The housing they provided didn't have any running water, so there was no possibility to get washed up. The living conditions in the ghetto were harsh and inhumane. There was terrible overcrowding in the apartments. There was totally inadequate cooking, bathing, and sanitary conditions. The main meal consisted of a little potato soup. The gendarmes would torture Jews into confessing where they hid their valuables. Now, you need to keep in mind, these were Hungarian gendarmes, not German Nazis. There were no German Nazis around at this point. So my mother and her two sisters and her father stayed in the Nyregyhaza ghetto for about 4 weeks, from April 14th to May 17th. The deportation of Jews from ghettos in Hungary began on May 15th, 1944. The first train left Nyregyhaza for Auschwitz on May 17th, 1944. My mother, her father, and her sisters would have been on this train. I know this since her documents from Auschwitz say that she arrived there on May 20th, and it generally took 3 to 4 days by train to get from Hungary to Auschwitz. People were permitted to take along only a limited number of items for the journey. They marched the people from the ghetto to the freight train yard. The boxcars were totally crammed with people, 80 to 100 people per car. They traveled for 3 to 4 days. They only had the food that they brought with them. They were given 1 bucket with water and 1 bucket for toilet facilities. So after being on the train for 3 to 4 days, my mother, her father, and 2 sisters arrived in Auschwitz on May 20th, 1944. They would have been on one of the first transports from Hungary. When they got off the train, they were told to leave any baggage and packages behind. Everyone went through a selection process. Mothers with children, the sick, and older people were told to go to the left. They went straight to the gas chambers. This is what would have happened to my mother's father, and in fact, it's what happened to over 80% of the people on that train. The others were told to go to the right and were selected for slave labor. My mother's younger sister, Eva, was initially selected to go to the left, but the older sister, Margit, jumped out of the line and pulled her over to the line going to the right, thereby endangering her own life, but saving her sister's life. They lined up those going to the right, including my mother and her sister, in rows of 5. They took them to the showers. They gave them prisoners' uniforms. They took away their own clothes. Then they cut off all their hair. They looked into their mouths, and if they had any gold teeth, they pulled them out without any anesthetics. At some point, they were tattooed with their registration numbers. These numbers were now their identity. I learned from the Auschwitz registration documents that my mother and her 2 sisters had 3 consecutive registration numbers. This shows that they must have stayed right by each other from the time they left their home until they were registered in Auschwitz. Their father would have also stayed right by them until he was separated. They were assigned to slave labor, working 12 hours a day. Faced with starvation, overwork, and disease, many of these prisoners died. My mother was in Auschwitz from May 20th, 1944 to September 5th, 1944, when she was transferred to Buchenwald. My mother's registration papers show that she and her 2 sisters were transferred from Auschwitz on September 5th, 1944, and arrived in Buchenwald on September 21st, 1944. They were actually transferred to the site of the Junkers aircraft manufacturing plant in Markleesberg, Germany, to perform slave labor there. This was one of the many subcamps associated with Buchenwald. And a concentration camp was built about 2 miles from the factory. Between September 1944 and December 1944, the SS sent 1,300 Hungarian women to this camp from Auschwitz. Afterward, the inmates returned under SS escort back to the concentration camp near the factory. The SS collected huge amounts of money for leasing of slave labor. Life in the camp was harsh. Factory labor was exhausting. They worked 12-hour shifts. Life would have been made more tolerable by establishing a support system of camp sisters and camp families. This would have been a situation where if an inmate had worked closely with another inmate, they would have temporarily adopted each others as sisters and would have been very helpful and supportive of each other. One of the inmates was quoted as saying, "Being together gave us a psychological sense of protection." Now, my mother would have had a ready-made family with her 2 sisters there. So the camp in Markleesberg existed from August 31st, 1944 to April 13th, 1945. Then, as the Allied forces were getting close, the SS drove the inmates on a death march. 1,500 women were sent on the march without food or proper clothes. They walked in wooden shoes with no socks in harsh wintry conditions. This is where my mother did talk often about how brave her younger sister Eva was in going to the nearby farms to steal potatoes for them to eat. You would have had to do something like that to survive, because the only other thing you would have had to eat were maybe leaves from the trees or insects you got from the ground. So the marchers arrived in Terezin, a concentration camp and ghetto in the Czech Republic, on April 29, 1945. They had walked for 16 days, between 18 and 25 miles a day, a total of about 224 miles, with almost no food. Many of the marchers died of exhaustion and starvation. Many left the march at various places to try and make it on their own. There had been 1,539 prisoners at Markleesberg. The number who reached Terezin was 685. A few hundred had left the march, but the rest of the 1,539 died along the way. So on May 2nd, 1945, 2 days after the marchers arrived, the International Red Cross took over the camp at Terezin. And on May 8th, 1945, the Terezin ghetto was liberated by the Red Army. So after they were liberated, my mother and 2 sisters decided to go back to their home in Hungary rather than go to a displaced persons camps, as did a lot of survivors for other countries. One reason for this was to try and connect with surviving relatives, as they hadn't been away all that long, mostly less than a year. Also, since they hadn't been away too long, it was more likely to be able to get back their homes. So they probably would have tried to catch trains going toward Hungary and ride on top of the trains, as it would have been almost impossible to try and get tickets for seats on the trains. So when they got back, they found that their father hadn't survived, but that 2 of the 4 brothers had survived. When they got back to their family home, they would have been in for a shock. It would have been either occupied by another family, or the house would have been totally ruined. All the furniture would have been gone. The door, windows removed, floors torn up. So the house would have been totally uninhabitable. Also, there was no Jewish community left in the town, or even a synagogue. So within 1 or 2 years, almost all the Jews had moved away from Ujfeherto. My mother and her 2 sisters all got married soon after getting home, They were eager to carry on with their life and have a family, have someone to provide some emotional support after the hard time and great losses they experienced. Now, there wouldn't have been any long courtships. They would have been introduced to each other by a friend or relative and soon got married. In fact, when I asked my mother how she met my father, she just replied that, oh, we just married each other. She told my sister something a little different. She says she was introduced to my father through my father's sister. And although she didn't know him very well, he was good looking. So she thought, well, why not get married? So I guess mothers will tell their daughters somewhat different things than they tell their sons. So they got married, moved to Budapest, and had two children. I was born in Budapest in 1946 and my sister in 1953. My mother's two sisters moved to Debrecen, a city of 200,000 people, about 20 miles from Ujfeherto. Each sister had one child. The sisters stayed close, even though they now lived in different cities. As a child, I would go every summer to visit my cousins and aunts and uncles in Debrecen. Well, as it turned out, my mother's travels weren't done when she got back to Hungary. Soviet troops liberated Hungary from the Nazis, and there was a very large Soviet military presence in Hungary after the war. And Hungary became a communist country in 1948. Most businesses were nationalized and farms were collectivized. Things became very repressive in the country. The secret police arrested many people. Eventually, people demanded reforms, and this led to the Hungarian Revolution of October 1956. This was a popular uprising that overthrew the communist Soviet-controlled government and temporarily installed an independent Hungarian government. But within 2 weeks, the revolution was crushed by force by the Soviet army. After the revolution was forcefully put down, about 200,000 people escaped from Hungary to Austria, including a disproportionate number of Hungarian Jews, about 20,000. So our family and the families of my mother's two sisters decided to escape from Hungary. One brother had already left in 1948 and settled in Canada. It wasn't an easy decision to escape. My father had his own small business, and we lived in a nice house in a suburb of Budapest. The night before we left, I remember my father saying to one of the relatives staying at our house, "I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for the future of our children." My father actually decided to send my mother, my sister, and I ahead with my mother's sister's family, and he would stay behind to transfer our house to a relative and to transfer his glass business to an associate. It was a difficult and dangerous undertaking to get across the border from Hungary to Austria. We took a train to a town near the border. My father had hired a guide to help us get across the border. My uncle had to carry my sister on his back since she was only 4 years old. We started walking when it got dark, and we walked for 3 to 4 hours before we got to the border. Along the way, we had to cross a small stream in a boat. My aunt fell in the ice-cold water as she was getting into the boat and started screaming. Everyone told her to stop screaming because the border guards may hear her. So the guide left us off at the border, and we walked for several more hours on our own before we got to a place with some people in a barn when it was already starting to get light. So we had walked a total of about 8 hours. We slept for a few hours in the barn on some hay, and then the next day took a bus to Vienna. Meanwhile, my father was still in Hungary. It took him longer than he had expected to take care of his affairs. By the time he was ready to leave, it was early January of 1957, and the border between Hungary and Austria had again been closed. The only way he was able to get across was to jump on top of a freight train at the one stop it made near the Austrian border, and to jump off the train when it crossed into Austria. We stayed in Vienna for about 2 months. My mother's brother in Canada sponsored my mother and her two sisters and their families to move to Canada. We all arrived in Montreal, Canada around March of 1957. We all stayed with my mother's brother until we found a place of our own. Well, it wasn't easy for my parents to get adjusted to life in Montreal. They had to learn a new language and get used to different customs. Montreal was very cold in the winter with a lot of snow. It was actually harder for my father as he had to work for someone else at relatively low pay instead of having his own business. At one point, he told my mother that he wanted to go back to Hungary. My mother replied that if he goes back, he will be going back by himself. Well, that put an end to that conversation. What made it easier for my mother was having her two sisters and a brother close by for support. She was especially close with the two sisters. They lived near us and would come over to visit often. It was harder for my father not having his family close by for support, as his surviving relatives had moved to Israel. In 1968, my father found a better job in Chicago, so my parents and sister moved to Chicago. I was finishing college in Montreal at the time and stayed there for the time being. My parents seemed to do better in Chicago than they had in Montreal. Maybe it was because their English had gotten better by then and they had gotten used to the local customs. But my father was soon able to run his own small business and they bought their own house. My mother did miss not having her two sisters and brothers close by, although they did visit each other periodically. My father died at a relatively young age of 65, which was very hard on my mother, being in Chicago without any of her relatives except her two kids. But she soon started having grandchildren and had a total of 5 grandchildren. These grandchildren became the high point in her life. Her greatest pleasure was having her two kids' families over for a holiday dinner. She kept doing this to the end of her life. I remember in her later years, she would set the table for a holiday dinner several days in advance to be sure it was all ready. Well, as you can see, my mother had a hard life right to the end, but with the support of her family, especially her two sisters, she was able to persevere and have a happy and productive life. Well, that's the end of my story, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you would have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions. The first, you had mentioned that you got all those documents and from family. So what was it like getting those, and how much of your mother's story did you fill in with research of your own?
I was amazed to get these documents. A relative in Israel who very good at collecting sent them to me. A lot of the stuff I'd never seen, particularly I never knew that she was actually transferred from Auschwitz to Buchenwald. So that's what I found out. And then I did some research on that. I actually found a whole book written by a Hungarian woman about the experience in this camp in Buchenwald. So a lot of it came from my research, yeah.
That's amazing. What's the next one? Let's see. Have you gone back and kind of personally retraced your family's steps in Hungary and in Europe? And
I have gone back several times. I've only once, as I told in my story, I only once went to their hometown and we went to the cemetery. Since my mother didn't tell me much about her background, there wasn't much else that I could trace since I really didn't know where they lived. So mainly what I did when we went back is go to the cemetery to find some older relatives there.
Okay. And then what was it like for you growing up as a child of survivors?
Well, in the early years, I heard very little about it, but every once in a while they would just say hello and say something about a relative, not get into any detail, like the type of things they might say is, oh, that person didn't come back from the war, and that was the extent of it. So it left sort of somewhat of a mystery as far as what actually happened. I didn't really find out the details till much later.
And then when did you start sharing your mother's story and why?
Well, I only just started recently when I was asked about being a second generation speaker. By then I'd been a docent at the Holocaust Museum, so I became familiar with a lot of the things there. And so I thought, and then when I didn't have documents until I got this from the Rolson archives and the book. So it was mainly after I got these material. And why I did it, it was first, I want to leave something behind as far as my parents' memory. And even though it's mainly about my mother, I did put in things about my father also. So it was mainly to leave something about their memory and to be able to tell people what happened.
Right. Let's see. I think one last question is just what do you want people to have learned from hearing your mother's story, and what can they carry over into today?
Well, the one thing that strikes me about her story is how close she was with her sisters and how important this was for their survivor, the one and that pulled the one sister that pulled the other one out of the line, and the other one that got food for them. So to me, it left this impression that it is important to have family or friends that you're close to, especially when you run into some problems in life.
Wonderful. That is all the questions I'm seeing right now, so I will let you say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you again for tuning in. Join us here Wednesday, June 9th at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear Holocaust survivor Marian Dykman share her story. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.